Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. Every keeper writes until the day they stop. That is the nature of a log. But not every stopping is the same. For 130 years, someone had climbed the same tower every single evening and written down what the sea had done that day. A storm, a wreck the light could not prevent, a widow who kept the flame alone through a winter that should have broken her and did not. Generation after generation, one keeper taking up the pen the exact moment the last one set it down. The chain had never once been broken. Until now, Thomas Calder wrote his final entry on an ordinary October afternoon, in a hand already beginning to fail him. And then, some weeks later, he simply stopped. Forever. And 300 miles away, in a London kitchen, his granddaughter was about to open an envelope that would ask her to do something she did not yet feel ready for. Pick the pen back up and keep a light that had never, in a century and a half, gone dark on anyone's watch. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew the envelope on her counter had been waiting 4 days, and that she could not put off opening it any longer. The letter had been sitting there since Tuesday, and she had known what it would say before she slit it open, had known it from the particular weight of the paper and the solicitor's careful handwriting on the front, and the postmark from a town on the Northumberland coast she had not visited in 11 years. Her grandfather had been unwell for some time. She had known this in the way you know a fact you have not let yourself feel, holding it at a certain distance, arranging her days around a version of the world in which he was simply far away rather than failing, because the alternative had seemed, from London, too large a thing to carry alongside her ordinary Tuesdays. She worked at a small museum near Bloomsbury, in a department that most visitors never saw, cataloguing and repairing paper. Old letters, ships' manifests, parish records, the odd, fragile map, with its ink gone the color of weak tea. It was careful work, patient work, the kind that asked you to slow your hands to the speed of the object in front of you rather than the speed of your own life. And she had always thought, without quite articulating it, that this was why she had chosen it. She liked things that had already survived a great deal and simply needed someone to keep them from disappearing further. She had not made the connection, not fully, between this work and her grandfather's decades at the Lighthouse, though her colleagues sometimes did, remarking on it lightly, as if it were an amusing coincidence rather than the shape of an inheritance she had not yet opened. The letter, when she finally opened it, said less than she expected and more than she was ready for. Thomas Calder had died peacefully, at home, in the cottage attached to the lighthouse at Fenner's Point, the place he had kept for 41 years, and continued to live in and tend long after the light itself had been automated, and the official keeping of it handed to a machine in a distant control room that required no one to climb the gloshed tower at dusk. He had left the cottage, the tower, the small parcel of land, and everything within them to his granddaughter. Iris, his only remaining family, with no further instruction beyond a single line, the solicitor read aloud to her over the telephone in a voice that seemed faintly embarrassed by its own sentiment. The light still needs keeping, even if only in the old way. She will understand what I mean. Or she will learn to. She had taken a week's leave from the museum, telling her supervisor it was for the funeral and the sorting of an estate, both of which were true, without telling him that she had no return date in mind because she did not yet have one to give. She packed lightly. 2 changes of clothes, waterproofs she had not worn since a walking holiday some years before, and, almost as an afterthought, the small leather satchel of paper conservation tools she kept at home for private jobs, the bone folder and the soft brushes and the rolls of Japanese tissue, though she told herself she was not bringing them for any particular purpose, only because she did not like to be far from them. The journey north took the better part of a day, a train from King's Cross that grew emptier the further it travelled, the flat fields of the Midlands giving way gradually to hills, and then to the long grey suggestion of the coast somewhere beyond the window, glimpsed and lost and glimpsed again. She changed at a station with a single platform and a waiting room that smelled of damp wool, and took a bus that wound along narrow roads between hedges grown high with the last of the summer's growth, past farms and a church with a square Norman tower, and, eventually, a village she recognized only distantly, the way you recognize a face from childhood photographs, rather than from memory itself. The bus set her down at the top of the lane that led out toward the point, and did not wait, pulling away almost before she had her bag properly settled on her shoulder, leaving her alone in a quiet, broken only by wind, and, somewhere beneath it, a low, continuous sound. She did not immediately place, and then did, with a small internal lurch, as the sea. She had forgotten the sound of it, or had not forgotten so much as filed it somewhere she did not often visit, and standing now at the top of the lane with the wind pulling at her coat, she found it returning to her all at once, whole and complete. The particular texture of it, neither loud nor gentle, simply continuous, the sound a coastline makes when it has been making it for longer than anyone currently alive. She walked. The lane ran between low stone walls furred with lichen, past a scattering of cottages with their curtains drawn against the wind, past a telephone box no longer in use, its glass replaced with a notice board advertising a coffee morning that had already happened, and a lost cat that had, according to a handwritten addition at the bottom, since been found. The land rose gently, and then more steeply, the hedges thinning, and finally giving way altogether to open grass and gorse, and the sense, growing with every step, of a great deal of sky. She saw the lighthouse before she saw the cottage, the tower appearing first as a pale vertical mark against the grey of the sky, and then, as she came over the last rise, resolving into its full shape, white painted stone banded once in red near the top, standing at the very end of the headland, where the land gave up its argument with the sea and simply stopped. It was smaller than she remembered, or she was larger than she had been, or both were true at once, in the way that returning to a childhood place always produces both sensations together, the object diminished and the feeling around it not diminished at all. Beside it, tucked into the lee of the tower as if for shelter, stood the keeper's cottage, low and grey-slated, with a garden gone slightly wild in front of it, the roses unpruned and thrown out in long canes across the path, the last of the summer's growth in a state of gentle, unpanicked abandonment, the particular disorder of a garden whose keeper has simply, over recent months, had less strength than the season required. She stood at the gate for a while before opening it. The wind was steady here, coming off the sea without interruption, carrying salt and the faint mineral smell of wet rock. And something else beneath it, gorse perhaps, or the particular scent of coastal grass that she could not have named, but that struck her, standing there, as entirely and specifically the smell of this place and no other, a smell that had been present at the edge of every childhood summer she had spent here and that she had not known. Until this moment, she still carried. The gate was unlocked. She had expected this, in a way, though she could not have said why, only that it seemed consistent with everything she remembered of her grandfather, a man who had never quite trusted locks, who had kept the cottage door on nothing stronger than a latch for as long as she had known him, on the theory, stated more than once at the kitchen table, that anyone determined enough to break in deserved, at minimum, to find something worth the trouble. The path to the front door was gravel, weeded through in patches, and she walked it slowly, letting herself arrive rather than simply covering the distance, aware of a reluctance in her own steps that she recognized as something closer to respect than fear. The key the solicitor had sent her turned out not to be needed. The door opened at a push, the latch not properly caught, and she stood for a moment on the threshold before stepping through, the way you might pause before entering water you know will be cold. The hallway was narrow and low-ceilinged, flagstone underfoot, worn into a shallow dip in the center of each stone. From what she understood, standing there, to be more than a century of feet crossing in exactly this path. Keeper after keeper, this cottage having served the light for far longer than her grandfather's own tenure, a fact she had known distantly and now felt, for the first time, as something closer to weight. Coat hooks lined the right-hand wall, and on them hung what she recognized immediately as her grandfather's oilskins, the heavy yellow coat gone, the color of old butter with age and salt, a woolen cap beside it, and beneath, on the flagstones, a pair of boots still bearing the pale crust of dried mud and salt at their toes, standing exactly where he must have stepped out of them for what she now understood to have been the last time. She looked at the boots for a long moment. She did not touch them. The cottage smelled of him in the particular way that houses hold a person after they have gone, not as a haunting but as a residue, chemical and physical and entirely ordinary. Pipe, tobacco, long since abandoned, but somehow still present in the walls. Coal smoke. The faint tallow smell of the paraffin lamps he had never entirely given up, even after electricity reached the point, and beneath all of it, something that was simply him, indefinable, the smell of person, leaves in a house they have lived in alone for 4 decades. A smell she had not thought about in 11 years, and that returned to her now whole and immediate, so that she stood in the narrow hallway with her hand still on the doorframe and let herself feel, without resisting it, the particular grief of a smell that would, she understood, begin fading from this moment onward, diminishing with every day she spent airing the rooms and opening the windows, until eventually it would be gone and this cottage would smell only of itself or of her. She moved through the rooms slowly, in no particular order beyond the order the house itself seemed to suggest, letting herself simply notice rather than yet deciding what to do with any of it. The sitting room held a low fire grate, cold now, laid but unlit, the last fire he had built and never burned, and she found herself staring at the careful arrangement of kindling and coal for longer than the sight warranted, thinking of his hands laying it, thinking that some version of him had expected to sit here again. A worn armchair faced the window, angled not toward the fire but toward the sea, as if the view had always mattered more than the warmth. And beside it, a small table held a pair of reading glasses, folded, and a book with a ribbon marking a page he would not now finish. And she left both exactly as they were, understanding without deciding it consciously that some things in this house would need to be moved eventually, and this was not yet, one of them. The kitchen was through an arch at the back, small and practical, a range against one wall still faintly warm. She noted with a small jolt, from what must have been the neighbor who had been looking in. The solicitor had mentioned this. A woman from the village who had kept the range fed and the pipes from freezing in the weeks since his death, out of the kind of quiet neighborliness that coastal villages seem to specialize in, tending to things without announcement or expectation of thanks. A scrubbed table stood in the center, a single chair pulled slightly out from it, and on the windowsill above the sink, facing the sea, a row of small objects that she understood immediately to be his, in the specific way that certain arrangements only ever belong to one person. A smooth gray stone, a scrap of blue sea glass, a gull's feather standing upright in an old ink bottle, small things gathered, she supposed, on walks along the shore over years, kept for no reason beyond the keeping of them. It was in the kitchen that she found the first sign of what would, over the following days, come to matter more than anything else in the cottage. A door beside the range, which she had taken at first for a pantry, opened instead onto a narrow stone staircase, steep and cold, leading down, and then, she realized as she stood at the top of it with her hand on the frame, also connecting somewhere above to a second door she had not yet located, the whole thing clearly a later addition, threading a private passage between the cottage and the tower itself, so that a keeper need not go out into the weather to reach his post. She stood at the top of the stairs for a while before deciding not to descend yet, choosing instead to finish her circuit of the cottage rooms first, aware of a growing sense that the tower, when she reached it, would want more of her attention than she yet had to give. Upstairs held 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom added, by the look of the tiling, sometime in the middle of the last century. The larger bedroom was his, the bed neatly made, a woolen blanket folded at its foot, and she understood, looking at it, that the neighbor had made this bed too. In the days after, a small kindness performed without being asked, the sort of thing you did for someone who could no longer do it for themselves. She did not go in. She pulled the door most of the way closed, the way she had seen done in other houses at other times, leaving it not entirely shut, and told herself this was not yet a decision, only a postponement. The smaller room, she understood the moment she opened the door, had been hers, or had been kept as though it might one day be hers again. A single bed with a patchwork quilt she remembered from childhood summers, faded now but recognizably the same. The same small chest of drawers, the same window looking out not toward the sea but toward the headland grass, and, beyond it, a narrow glimpse of the lighthouse itself rising white against the sky. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, the quilt cool and slightly rough beneath her palm, and let herself simply be 12 years old again for the length of one breath. Summers of long light evenings and her grandfather's slow, unhurried explanations of tides and currents and the names of birds, before standing again and continuing her circuit. Because there would be time later, she told herself. For sitting, she spent the remainder of the afternoon in the ordinary business of arrival. The business that every visitor to every empty house must eventually attend to, regardless of the weight of the circumstances that brought them there. She found the fuse box and confirmed the electricity was live. She found the immersion heater and switched it on, so that there would be hot water by evening. She unpacked her small bag into the chest of drawers in the room that had been hers, folding her few clothes with more care than they required, simply for the occupation of her hands. She walked the short distance to the village shop, a 15-minute walk along the coast path that she remembered. Halfway there, walking with a specific and total clarity, every dip and rise of the path returning to her feet before her mind had caught up to remembering it, and bought bread and milk and eggs and tea from a shopkeeper who looked at her for a long moment before saying quietly, "You'll be Thomas's granddaughter." And then, before she could properly answer, "He was a good man. We were all very fond of him," in a tone that closed the subject gently, rather than pursuing it, the particular tact of a small community that has learned, over generations of loss, exactly how much sympathy a person can absorb from a stranger across a shop counter, and exactly when to let them go. She ate a simple supper alone at the kitchen table as the light outside began its long, slow decline. The particular extended dusk of the far north in late summer, the sky holding its brightness for hours after the sun itself had dropped. And she found she did not mind the quiet of eating alone in a dead man's kitchen nearly as much as she had expected to, that there was something almost companionable in it. The range still giving off its low warmth, the row of small objects on the windowsill catching the last of the light, the sea continuing its steady conversation with the rocks below the point. Indifferent and constant, and, in its own way, entirely reassuring. It was after supper, with the dishes washed and set to dry, and the last of the daylight fading properly at last into a deep blue dusk, that she found herself standing again at the top of the narrow stone stairs beside the range, and this time she did not hesitate. She took the small torch she had found in the kitchen drawer, more from habit than necessity, since she could see a switch at the bottom of the stairs, and descended. The stairs opened into a low stone passage, cold in the way that stone below ground level is always cold, regardless of season. And this, in turn, opened, after perhaps a dozen steps, into the base of the tower itself, a circular room with walls a full arm's length thick, and here, arranged with an order that spoke of decades of careful habit, was the keeper's workroom. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply looking. Shelves ran the full curve of the wall, floor to a height well above her head, and on them, in careful chronological rows, stood books. Not the leather-bound register she had half expected from old films about lighthouses, but a long, unbroken sequence of plain, cloth-bound ledgers, each one labeled on its spine, in a hand that changed subtly over the run of them, the ink darker, and the writing rounder in the earliest volumes, growing more angular and familiar as the sequence progressed, until the final decades of spines were unmistakably her grandfather's own hand, the same hand that had written her birthday cards for 30 years. Small and precise, and slightly forward-leaning. She reached for the nearest of his volumes without quite deciding to, drawn to it the way you are sometimes drawn to touch a thing before you have consciously chosen to, and opened it at random. The page held, in neat columns, the record of a single day, decades ago, wind direction and strength the state of the sea, the times of the light's operation before automation had taken that particular task from him. Notes on vessels cited passing the point, their approximate course. It was, on its surface, entirely dry. A record of weather and traffic kept for reasons of maritime record-keeping that had, by the date of this entry, already become largely ceremonial, the official duty having passed elsewhere. And yet, reading down the column, she found that the dry factual record was not, in fact, the whole of the entry. Beneath the final line of weather notation, in the same careful hand but in a slightly different register, as though the keeper allowed himself this one line after the day's official business was concluded, was a single further sentence. Curlews on the headland again this evening, 3 of them, calling long after dark. And I stood at the rail and listened until I was too cold to stay. She turned the page and found another such sentence beneath the next day's weather, and another beneath the day after that. She understood, standing there in the workroom with the ledger open in her hands and the tower's cold pressing gently against her from every side, that this was what the solicitor's message had meant, or part of what it meant. The light still needs keeping, even if only in the old way. Not the mechanical keeping, which had passed long ago to an automated system in a control room she would likely never see, but this, the daily record, the single line at the end of the weather notes, the small human addition to an otherwise official form. Kept, not because anyone required it any longer, but because someone, keeper after keeper across what she now understood to be well over a century, had simply continued to keep it, had found it necessary or comforting, or both, to set down each evening not only what the sea and sky had done that day, but what it had felt like to stand and watch them do it. She carried the ledger back up to the kitchen table and returned for another, and then another, working her way backward through the shelves by torchlight, and then by the kitchen's electric light once she had settled properly at the table, reading not systematically but the way you might sample a long conversation. You have arrived at part-way through, dipping in at points that caught her eye, the fine, cramped hand of a keeper from decades before her grandfather's time, noting the wreck of a fishing boat weathered safely to harbor thanks to the light, the loss, in a much earlier volume still, of a keeper's wife to a fever one particular March, recorded with a briefness that somehow carried more weight than any elaboration could have. And then, weeks later in the same hand, a return to the ordinary weather notation. The keeping of the light continuing, because the light required continuing, regardless of what had been lost, to keep it. She read for longer than she meant to. The kitchen clock, when she finally looked at it, told her it was well past an hour she would ordinarily have considered late, and yet she did not feel tired in the way she had expected the day's travel to leave her. She felt instead a kind of alert stillness, the particular wakefulness that comes from having been given, unexpectedly, a great deal to think about. She closed the ledger she held, the second to last of her grandfather's own, and sat for a while longer at the table, with her hands flat on its worn wood, listening to the sea continuing its work below the point, indifferent to the hour, and thought, without quite deciding to think it, that she understood now why the solicitor's line had been phrased as it had. Not an instruction so much as a description of a fact that was, in this house, simply true. The light still needs keeping. She would understand what he meant, or she would learn to. She banked the range for the night. the way she remembered her grandfather doing on the coldest evenings of her childhood visits, an action her hands seemed to know before her mind had fully recalled it, and made her way up the narrow staircase to the room that had once been hers, the patchwork quilt cool against her as she slid beneath it, the window uncurtained so that the last pale line of dusk was still visible low over the headland grass. The lighthouse itself, a paler shape against the darkening sky, its automated light beginning its patient, mechanical sweep somewhere far above her, doing the work it had always done, regardless now of any keeper's hand. She lay listening to the house settle around her, small ticks and creaks of old wood and stone adjusting to the falling night temperature, and beneath it, always, the sea, patient and unhurried and entirely certain of itself, the way the sea always was, whether or not anyone stood at the rail above it to notice. She thought of the curlews calling long after dark, 3 of them, and the keeper who had stood in the cold to listen. She thought of the row of ledgers waiting below in the workroom, the long, unbroken conversation she had only begun to read, stretching back further than she yet knew, waiting to be continued. She thought, drifting now toward sleep in the small bed that had once been hers, and might, she understood without quite deciding it, be hers again for longer than a week, that tomorrow she would go down to the tower properly, in daylight, and see the lamp room itself, and the rail where the keepers had stood, and that she would, she thought, before sleep finally took her, want to write something in a ledger of her own before very much longer. Not yet, but before very much longer. The wind moved steadily over the headland through the night, carrying salt and the low, continuous sound of the sea against the rocks below the point, and the automated light turned above the tower in its patient mechanical sweep, on and on, exactly as it had turned the night before and would turn the night after, needing, for its actual operation, no one at all. And in the small room with the patchwork quilt, Iris Calder slept more deeply than she had slept in months, the cottage settling quietly around her, holding, in its stone and its shelves, and its row of small objects on the kitchen windowsill, the accumulated patience of more than a century of keeping, waiting, without any particular urgency, for whatever she would decide to add to it. She woke the next morning to a light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The particular quality of light in a room with no curtains on a coast with nothing between the window and the horizon, pale gold and slightly diffuse, filtered through a thin morning mist that she could see, sitting up slowly, was already beginning to burn away over the sea. The headland grass beyond the window, catching the early sun in long silver sweeps as the wind moved through it. She lay for a while simply watching this, unhurried, feeling none of the low dread that had accompanied so many recent London mornings, the particular anxious weight of a day that had to be gotten through, and understood, lying there, that this, in itself, was worth noticing. The absence of a feeling she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped registering it as a feeling at all, had simply mistaken it for the ordinary texture of being awake. She dressed and went down to a kitchen that had cooled overnight but not gone properly cold, the range's residual warmth still present in the stones around it, and made tea in a pot she found in the cupboard above the sink, taking her cup out to stand in the overgrown garden while it was still too hot to drink, watching the mist finish its slow retreat from the water below the point. The sea, in full daylight, was a color she did not have an immediate word for, somewhere between gray and green and a blue that only appeared where the sun caught it directly. And it moved, she noticed, watching it properly for the first time since her arrival, in a way that was neither calm nor rough, but simply itself, a working sea rather than a picturesque one, carrying, she supposed, exactly the same weather and the same traffic her grandfather had spent 41 years recording in the ledgers below the tower. She spent the morning on what she thought of, without quite naming it to herself as such, as the beginning of her education. She returned to the workroom, and this time worked through the shelves with more purpose, not reading every entry, but taking down volume after volume to understand the shape of the whole collection. The earliest dated from a year she had to read twice, to be certain she had understood correctly. The sequence beginning not with her grandfather, or even his father, but with a keeper, 3 generations further back, a man named Josiah Rennick, whose name meant nothing to her, and whose hand, in the earliest surviving volume, was formal and looping in a way that belonged unmistakably to a much older century. She understood, standing in the cold workroom with this earliest ledger open in her hands, that the conversation she had stumbled into the night before was very much longer than she had first appreciated, that her grandfather had been not the originator of this practice, but simply its most recent voice. One keeper among a line of keepers stretching back to a time before the light had even been electrified, each one adding his own single sentence to the record beneath the weather. Each one, she supposed, standing at some point at the same iron rail she had not yet visited, watching the same sea do what it had always done. She found, tucked into the back of one of the middle volumes, a folded sheet that turned out to be a hand-drawn diagram of the lamp mechanism, as it had existed before automation, annotated in a hand 2 generations older than her grandfather's, showing the oil reservoir and the clockwork mechanism that had once turned the lens by a weight-driven system requiring winding every few hours through the night, a keeper's whole existence organized. She understood, reading the careful annotations, around the necessity of climbing the tower stairs at intervals, through the darkness, to keep the great lens turning, so that ships far out on the water would see not a steady light but a light that flashed in a particular pattern, unique to this point of coast, telling any vessel that saw it exactly where along the dangerous shore it stood. She found this both extraordinary and, in a way she had not expected, moving. The thought of a man climbing these same stairs by lamplight through the small hours of a winter night, alone, because a system of ships he would mostly never see depended on his waking to do it. She climbed the tower itself that afternoon, taking the internal stair from the workroom rather than going out into the wind, counting without quite meaning to the turns of the narrow spiral as she climbed, the stone walls close enough on either side that her shoulders nearly brushed them, small deep-set windows at intervals, offering brief framed glimpses of sea and sky that shifted with dizzying speed as she climbed past them, until she emerged, slightly breathless, into the lamp room itself. It was smaller than she had imagined, a circular chamber entirely glazed, the great lens standing at its center on the automated mechanism that had replaced, decades ago, the weight-driven clockwork of the diagram she had found below. And around it, at waist height, ran the iron rail she had been thinking of since the night before. The rail her grandfather and Josiah Rennick and every keeper between them had stood at, looking out over the same sea, the same headland, the same long grey coast stretching away in both directions further than she could clearly see. She stepped out onto the small external gallery beyond the glazing. The wind immediately stronger and colder up here, carrying the sea's sound directly and without the muffling of stone walls, and stood with both hands on the rail exactly as she imagined every keeper before her had stood, and looked out, and understood, in a way she had not quite managed to understand from the ledgers alone, precisely why a person might choose to spend 41 years of an ordinary life in exactly this posture, watching exactly this view, and find in it not confinement, but something closer to its opposite. She stayed on the gallery for a long while, long enough that her hands grew properly cold on the iron rail, watching a single fishing boat make its slow way along the coast some distance out, watching the light itself, dormant now in full daylight, waiting for the dusk that would set its automated mechanism turning again regardless of whether anyone stood here to see it. She thought of the curlews her grandfather had recorded, calling long after dark. She thought of the single sentences beneath the weather notation. Decades of them. A whole life recorded not in its large events but in its small evening observations. The birds, the light on the water, the particular quality of a given dusk, she thought, standing there with the wind moving steadily past her and the sea working below, unhurried and endless, that she understood now, more fully than she had the night before, exactly what it was she had been left, and exactly what it was going to ask of her. She descended eventually, cold enough that the workroom's stone chill felt almost warm by comparison, and spent the remainder of the afternoon in the ordinary tasks of settling further into the cottage, tasks she found herself performing with an attention she did not usually bring to domestic chores, aware that she was, in some slow and unannounced way, moving in. She aired the larger bedroom, opening its window to the sea wind for the first time in what she guessed had been some weeks, and found, doing this, that she could stand in the doorway now without the earlier hesitation. The room, simply a room, her grandfather's absence from it, a fact, rather than a wound, at least for the length of this particular afternoon. She found the airing cupboard and the location of the spare linens. She found, in a drawer in the sitting room, a stack of letters tied with string that she did not open, setting them aside for a day when she felt equal to them, and a tin of photographs that she did look through, briefly, finding among them a small faded print of a girl of perhaps 10, standing at the base of the tower with her grandfather's hand resting on her shoulder, and understood, looking at it, that the girl was herself. From a summer she had no independent memory of at all, and sat with this thought for a while before setting the tin carefully back in its drawer. By evening she had established, without quite deciding to establish it, the rough shape of a routine. She lit the range properly for the first time, feeding it the way she remembered, and made a supper of eggs and the last of the bread, and ate it at the kitchen table with one of her grandfather's ledgers open beside her plate, continuing where she had left off the night before, working now steadily backward through his volumes rather than sampling at random, watching the small evening sentences accumulate across years she had not been present for, weather and birds and the particular light on the water on evenings she had spent. She calculated once, working out the dates, sitting in a shared flat in London, marking her own days by entirely different measures. She found, near the end of supper, an entry that stopped her properly. It was from some years before, the ink slightly different. A pen he must have replaced part-way through the volume, and beneath the day's weather notation the single line read, simply, "Iris rang this evening, second time this month, and it does my heart good to hear her voice, even down a bad line. Though I wish she would come and see the place properly again before I am too old to show her the difference between a curlew's call and a peewit's, which I am fairly sure she still cannot tell apart. She sat with this for a long time, the range ticking gently as it cooled. The kitchen window gone dark now with the fallen evening, and felt the particular grief of arriving somewhere too late to give the thing that had been quietly, patiently wanted, a visit, a proper visit, not a phone call down a bad line, but her actual presence in this actual kitchen which she was giving now, finally, to an empty house, rather than to the man who had wanted it. She did not close the ledger. She sat instead for a while longer, and then, moved by an impulse she did not examine too closely, went to the dresser drawer, where she had noticed, that morning, a stack of fresh, unused ledgers, identical in binding to the completed volumes on the workroom shelves, evidently kept in reserve against the day the current volume was filled, and took one and a pen from the same drawer, and carried both back to the table, and sat looking at the first blank page for a long while before she wrote anything at all. She did not, in the end, attempt the weather notation, not yet, not knowing enough yet of what was properly required, the wind directions, and the specific vocabulary of decades of maritime record-keeping she had only begun to absorb. She wrote, instead, simply the date, and beneath it a single line. In a hand, she was aware, writing it, sat somewhere between her own ordinary handwriting and something more careful, more deliberate, as though the ledger itself asked a certain steadiness of anyone who wrote in it. Arrived properly today, she wrote. Read further into the workroom shelves. Climbed the tower and stood at the rail where he must have stood 10,000 times. I understand a little more of it than I did yesterday, though not yet enough to say I have learned to keep anything. I am sorry I did not come sooner. I think I am here now, for as long as the place will have me. She read the sentence back once, did not correct it, and closed the ledger, setting it beside her grandfather's most recent volume on the table. The two books sitting together in the lamplight, the old conversation and its newest, uncertain addition. Outside, the wind had settled into its steady night rhythm, and somewhere out on the darkening headland, distantly, she thought she heard, though she could not yet have told you with any confidence which bird it belonged to, a long, thin, carrying call repeated twice and then falling silent. And she sat, listening for it to come again, and did not yet know if it was curlew or peewit, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she very much wanted to learn the difference. The days that followed arranged themselves, without her quite deciding they should, into a shape she recognized only in retrospect as a routine, the particular unhurried architecture of a life organized around a place rather than around a diary of appointments. She woke early, not from any alarm but from the light itself. The uncurtained window admitting the pale gold of a coastal dawn well before any hour she would have called reasonable in London, and she found she did not resent this the way she might once have expected to, that there was something almost restorative in being woken by weather rather than by the small mechanical insistence of a phone. On the third morning she walked properly into the village, not for supplies this time, but simply to walk, taking the coast path rather than the lane, the grass either side of it silvered with dew and the sea, far below on her left, catching the early light in long moving sheets. She met, on the path, a woman perhaps 20 years her senior, walking a small terrier that took an immediate and businesslike interest in her boots, and the woman, straightening from calling the dog off, looked at her for a moment. With a particular assessing look Iris had begun to recognize from the shopkeeper, and said, "You're stopping on, then?" Not quite a question. And Iris found herself answering, for the first time aloud to anyone, "Yes, I think I am." And the woman nodded once, satisfied, as though this had confirmed something she had already suspected, and said her name was Margaret Fenwick, and that she was the one who had kept the range going through the worst of it, and that she was glad, very glad, there would be someone up at the point again, because a light that no one lived beside never felt quite properly kept, whatever the automated mechanism might manage on its own. They walked together as far as the village, Margaret talking easily of small things, the state of the harbour wall after the winter storms, a nephew who had gone for a fisherman down the coast, the vicar's ongoing campaign to have the church roof seen to before the damp got into the beams properly. And Iris found herself listening with a kind of attention she did not often bring to small talk, aware that this was, in its own modest way, part of the education she had come here for. The slow accumulation of a place's ordinary details, the names and the small histories that would, given enough time, stop being things she was told and start being things she simply knew. It was Margaret, standing outside the shop with her terrier sitting patiently at her feet, who told her, in the manner of someone passing on a piece of information she assumed was already known, that Thomas Calder had kept the light's old lamp room spotless right up until the last few weeks, climbing the tower most fair evenings, even after his legs had begun to trouble him, not because the automated system required it of him, but because he said a lens left uncleaned was a disrespect to every keeper who had climbed those stairs before him. And Iris, hearing this, understood that the workroom's shelves and the tower's careful order were not simply the residue of a life recently ended, but the product of a discipline maintained, quite deliberately, right up until it could no longer be maintained, and felt, standing on the village street with a bag of groceries in her hand, a fresh wave of the particular grief that comes not from loss itself but from glimpsing, belatedly, the full shape of what had been lost. She returned to the cottage that afternoon and, for the first time, climbed the tower, not merely to look but to work, carrying up with her a soft cloth, and, from her own satchel, a small bottle of the same kind of mild solvent she used at the museum for cleaning delicate surfaces, reasoning that whatever was safe for 400-year-old parchment would very likely do no harm to glass. She spent the better part of 2 hours in the lamp room, working her way around the great lens with a patience that surprised her, wiping away the faint film of salt haze that had accumulated in recent weeks, and found, doing this careful, repetitive work in the small circular chamber, with the sea moving endlessly beyond the glazing, a stillness of mind she associated usually only with her most absorbing days at the museum bench, the particular calm that comes from giving your full attention to a single, finite, entirely achievable task. She began, over the following days, to read the ledgers with more system, no longer simply sampling but working her way properly through entire decades, and found, doing this, that the collection told a longer and richer story than she had first appreciated. She learned that Josiah Rennick, the earliest keeper whose hand appeared on the shelves, had kept the light for nearly 30 years before handing it to his son, and that the son had, in turn, kept it for a further 22, before a keeper unrelated to the family. A man named Abel Stern had held the post through what she gathered from a handful of terse entries had been a difficult decade of storms and at least one wreck. The light had failed, through no fault of the keeping, to prevent. She read Abel Stern's account of that wreck, written the morning after, factual, and restrained in a way that somehow made the grief beneath it more visible rather than less. The fishing crew lost within sight of the light itself. The keeper's evident sense, never stated outright, but present in every careful word, that he had done everything the light could do, and it had, on that one occasion, simply not been enough. The sea being, as he wrote in the single line beneath that day's entry, older and larger than any lamp built to stand against it, and deserving always of more respect than we are inclined to give it on the calm days. She found, several volumes later, the record of her own great-grandfather taking up the post, the family name returning to the shelves after Abel Stern's long tenure, and read with particular attention now, aware that she was reading, for the first time properly, her own history, laid out not as family legend, but as daily record, decades of weather and small evening observations accumulating into a life she had never been told about in any detail. Her great-grandfather noting, one autumn, the birth of a son. Her own grandfather, in a single restrained sentence beneath the weather that nonetheless carried, she thought, reading it, an unmistakable warmth. A boy born this morning, strong lungs on him already, louder by half than the fog signal, and it seems he means to keep this house on his own account rather than leave the sea to end our involvement with it, which suits me very well indeed. She sat with the ledgers most evenings now, the range warm behind her, her own volume open alongside whichever of the older books she was working through that day, and found herself adding, each night, a line or two of her own beneath a date, not yet the formal weather record, which she still did not entirely trust herself to keep accurately, but the kind of evening observation the family had apparently always permitted itself, the birds she was learning to distinguish, curlew from peewit, finally, and with some confidence, the particular color the sea took on a given evening. Small domestic notes about the range or the garden she had begun, tentatively to bring back into some order. She found that the act of writing these lines, brief as they were, had begun to change the shape of her days in a way she had not anticipated, that she noticed things now, walking the headland or standing at the kitchen window, with a specific attention she recognized as the attention of someone gathering material for an entry not yet written, the world outside sharpening slightly, becoming more particularly itself, because she now had somewhere to set down what she noticed of it. She wrote to the museum at the end of that first week, a longer message than she had originally intended, explaining that the estate required more of her time than she had first estimated, and found, composing it, that this was not entirely a fiction, that the estate did indeed require more of her, though not in the practical sense her supervisor would assume from the word, not solicitors and probate and the sorting of an old man's possessions, but something closer to an apprenticeship she had not known she was undertaking until she was several days into it. Her supervisor's reply, when it came, was kind and unhurried, granting a further fortnight's leave without difficulty, and she read it, standing in the cottage kitchen with the sea visible through the window. and felt, reading it, a small, unexpected lightness, as though a door she had not known was closed had been quietly opened. By the end of the first week, she had established, without quite naming it as such even to herself, the beginning of a rhythm that felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like the outline of an actual life. Mornings for the garden or the village or the ordinary business of the cottage. Afternoons, increasingly, for the tower. The lens kept now to a standard she suspected would have satisfied her grandfather. The workroom shelves, reorganized slightly, not out of any dissatisfaction with his system, but simply because handling every volume had given her a feel for where things properly belonged, that she wanted to preserve in the shelf's arrangement. Evenings for the ledgers, old and new, the sea audible always through the kitchen window, the range ticking as it cooled, the automated light beginning its patient sweep somewhere above her, the moment true dusk arrived. Doing, mechanically, the work that had once required a keeper's whole attention, while she, below, kept the other work going, the work the machine could not do, the daily record of a place and the person currently watching over it. She had not yet weathered a storm at the point. The week's weather having stayed remarkably settled, mild, bright days, with a steady onshore wind and clear, cold evenings, and she found herself reading Abel Stern's account of the wreck and her grandfather's own occasional notes on rougher winters, both curious and faintly apprehensive about what the point would become when the weather properly turned. Aware, from everything she had read, that a lighthouse kept its truest meaning not on the calm evenings she had so far known, but on the nights when the sea stopped being a pleasant sound beneath the window and became, instead, exactly the kind of danger the light and everyone who had ever kept it existed to answer. She did not yet know when that weather would come, but she found, closing her own ledger one evening near the end of that first week, the pen set down beside it, that she was no longer thinking of herself as a visitor waiting to see how long she would stay. She was thinking of herself, increasingly, and without any particular drama attached to the thought, as the current keeper of a place that had been kept, in one way or another, by someone standing exactly where she now stood, for longer than any single life could properly account for, and finding in this not a burden but something closer to the opposite, a specific and steadying sense of having, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, arrived somewhere she was meant to be. On the 9th evening, the weather began, finally, to shift. She noticed it first as a change in the quality of the light rather than anything more definite, the late afternoon sun going hazy and slightly bruised toward the horizon. The wind, which had held steady from the same quarter for the better part of a fortnight, backing round by evening to a colder point that carried, beneath its usual salt, a faint mineral sharpness. She did not yet have the experience to name, but that some old instinct, inherited or simply absorbed from a week of close attention to the sky, told her to take seriously. She climbed to the lamp room before dusk, not for any practical purpose the automated mechanism required of her, but because she found she wanted, on this particular evening, to be at the rail when whatever was coming arrived, and stood there a long while with her coat drawn close, watching the horizon thicken and darken in a way that felt different from the ordinary fall of night, the sea below taking on a heavier, more deliberate motion, the gulls that had wheeled easily over the headland all week, now flying low and direct, making, she thought, watching them, for whatever shelter gulls make for. She came down as the true dark fell, lit the range properly, and settled at the kitchen table with her grandfather's ledger and her own, and found, opening to the previous entries for this same week in years past, that this shift in weather appeared again and again across the decades. A late-season change nearly every keeper had noted in some form, the specific vocabulary varying with the writer, but the observation itself constant: wind backing, sky thickening, birds flying low, the sea's motion growing heavier hours before any actual storm made itself known. She understood, reading this, that she was not simply witnessing an isolated evening, but joining, in real time, a pattern that the ledgers had been quietly recording for well over a century, that every keeper who had ever sat at this table on an evening like this one had felt some version of the same alert stillness she felt now, watching the dark outside the window and listening to the sea's changing voice, and had written, in one hand after another, across the generations, some version of the same brief, watchful note. She wrote her own version of it that night, longer than her recent entries had been, setting down the backing wind and the low gulls and the sea's heavier motion with a care she had not quite managed in her earlier attempts. Feeling, writing it, that she was, for the first time, not merely observing the place, but beginning, properly, to keep it. In the old sense, the solicitor's message had meant. She added, beneath the observation, a final line she did not plan in advance, and that arrived, when she read it back, as simply and obviously true as anything she had written since arriving. Something is coming. I find I am not afraid of it. I think I have been waiting, without knowing it, to see what this place is, when it is not calm, and I am glad, in a way I would not have predicted a fortnight ago, that I will be here to see it. She closed the ledger, banked the range, and climbed the stairs to bed, with the wind already audible in a new register outside the window. No longer the steady, untroubled sound of the past fortnight, but something with more edge to it, more insistence, and lay for a long while in the dark, listening to it build, unafraid, in the way she had written, and thinking, before sleep finally came, of every keeper who had lain in some version of this same bed, on some version of this same night, listening to the same warning in the wind, and had risen the next morning, whatever the night had brought, to write the weather down and go on keeping the light. She woke before dawn to a sound she did not immediately recognize, a deep, irregular concussion somewhere beneath the wind, and lay for a moment in the dark before understanding it was the sea itself, striking the rocks below the point with a force entirely different from the steady working rhythm she had grown used to over the past fortnight. The window, uncurtained still, showed her nothing but a moving darkness, rain streaming sideways across the glass in sheets that caught what little grey light the hour offered. And beneath it, continuous now, the wind had risen into a sound with real weight to it, pressing against the old stone of the cottage in long, shuddering gusts that she felt as much as heard. A faint tremor carried up through the bed frame itself. She dressed quickly, in the warmest things she had brought, and went down to a kitchen that felt colder than any morning since her arrival, the range banked low overnight, and needing to be built up properly before it would give any real warmth. She fed it with the particular care she had learned over the past week, coaxing rather than forcing, and stood close to it while the kettle came to the boil, listening to the stormwork at the cottage from every side, the windows rattling faintly in their old frames. A loose slate somewhere overhead, ticking against its neighbors with each gust. She thought, standing there with her tea, of the ledgers and of every keeper who had stood in some version of this same kitchen, on some version of this same morning, and found that the thought steadied rather than frightened her, the way a familiar instruction steadies a person facing an unfamiliar task. She was not the first to face this. She would very likely not be the worst equipped to face it, given that she had spent the better part of a fortnight reading exactly how it had been faced before. She climbed to the tower once the light had properly come. Such as it was, a thin grey daylight that did little to soften the scene beyond the glazing, and found the lamp room. When she reached it, both more dramatic and less alarming than she had braced herself for. The sea beyond the rail had changed entirely from the working grey-green she had grown familiar with. Now a heaving field of white-flecked slate, the waves not simply moving but breaking against themselves, well out from the shore. The rocks below the point disappearing periodically beneath surges of white water before emerging again, streaming. The automated light itself continued its patient sweep, exactly as it had on every calm evening before, entirely unmoved by the weather it existed to warn against, doing its single mechanical task without any awareness of the difference between a still Tuesday and a morning like this one. The glazing itself shuddered faintly under the wind's pressure, a sound she had not heard before, and found, standing close to it, both alarming and oddly reassuring, evidence that the tower had been built with exactly this kind of morning in mind, its walls thick enough and its glass set firmly enough to have weathered, she supposed, several centuries of mornings considerably worse than this one. She thought of Josiah Rennick, standing in this same room in whatever storms his own century had thrown at the point, and of the woman who had kept the light through the years between the wars, tending her hens and her garden notes between storms very like this one, and found the tower's evident endurance across all those generations, a kind of company in itself, the stone around her holding, in its solid, unmoving mass, something of the same steadiness the ledgers held in their long, unbroken record. She did not go out onto the external gallery, the wind up here strong enough that she judged it unwise, but stood instead just inside, the glazing with both hands braced against the frame, watching, and found herself thinking of Abel Stern's account of the wreck decades before, and understood now, watching this sea, with a clarity she had not fully possessed reading it at the kitchen table, exactly how a keeper might stand in this very spot, and feel the full weight of what the light could and could not do. A lamp being, in the end, only a warning, only information offered to whoever was already out there and already fighting to use it. There was, this particular morning, no vessel in sight, and she found the empty sea in front of her both a relief and, in a way she had not expected, a source of its own quiet anxiety. The not knowing whether the emptiness meant every boat that might have been out had found harbor in good time, or simply that she could not see, through the driving rain, whatever might be struggling somewhere beyond the range of her eyes. She stayed at the glazing a long while, watching, and eventually made her way back down to the workroom, and then the kitchen, understanding that there was, in truth, very little for her actually to do beyond exactly what she was doing. Watching and recording, the modern light requiring no manual tending, the modern rescue services, should they be needed, reachable by a telephone in the hall rather than by any action she could take from the tower itself. Her role, she understood, settling, at last, back at the kitchen table, with the range built up properly now, and beginning to throw real warmth into the room, was smaller and quieter than the dramatic keeping of the old ledgers had perhaps led her to expect. And yet, no less real for its smallness. She was here. She was watching. She would set down, later, exactly what this day had been, and that record would join the long unbroken one on the workroom shelves, and in 100 years some other keeper, reading it, would understand a little better what a storm at this point had once looked like. The way she now understood, reading Abel Stern, what one had looked like in his time. The storm held through the whole of that day and into the evening, never quite building to the violence she had half feared from the wind's opening hours, but settling instead into a steady, relentless assault that she came to understand, as the hours passed, was simply what a proper coastal storm was. Not a single dramatic climax, but a long attritional pressure. Hour after hour of driving rain and heavy wind, and a sea that did not calm even slightly between 1 hour and the next. She spent the day in the ordinary tasks the weather allowed, checking the fuse box twice when the lights flickered without fully failing, moving a bucket beneath the loose slate she had identified from its ticking that morning. Once the rain began finding its way through, making a pot of soup from vegetables she had bought in the village and eating it slowly at the kitchen table with one of the middle-period ledgers open beside her bowl, reading through a run of storm entries from a decade she had not yet properly explored, finding in them the same careful, unfussed record-keeping that seemed to characterize every keeper's approach to weather like this. The storm noted, its force estimated, its duration recorded, and beneath it all, without fail, the same brief human observation that had come to feel, over the past fortnight, like the true purpose of the whole exercise. Wind still rising at dusk, no vessels sighted all day, for which I am grateful, though it makes for a long and watchful sort of quiet. The dog would not settle by the fire and kept going to the door, and I have let him out twice now to satisfy himself. There is nothing there, which there was not both times. The telephone rang in the middle of the afternoon, startling her slightly, the sound so at odds with the ordinary quiet of her days, at the point that it took her a moment to place it. It was Margaret, checking, in the unfussed manner of someone for whom this was simply an ordinary courtesy on a day like this rather than any special alarm, that the cottage was holding up and that Iris had candles to hand should the power fail properly, and mentioning, in passing, that her nephew's boat had gone out early that morning before the forecast had properly turned and had not yet been seen coming back into the small harbour further down the coast. She said this lightly, without any evident panic, in the tone of a woman who had spent her whole life around boats and knew the difference between ordinary lateness and genuine cause for alarm. But Iris found, setting the telephone down afterward, that she could not entirely shake the thought of it, and found herself climbing the tower stairs again within the hour, earlier than she would otherwise have gone, to stand at the glazing and watch the grey heaving water for any sign of a vessel making its way home. She stood there a long while, the light beginning its automated sweep early under the day's heavy cloud, the rain still driving hard against the glass, and saw, eventually, far out and low against the horizon, a small dark shape that resolved, as she watched it with a held breath she had not noticed holding, into a fishing boat, low in the water and clearly labouring, but making steady progress none the less toward the shelter of the coast. She watched it for the better part of 20 minutes, as it worked its way past the point, close enough at one stage that she could make out, or thought she could make out, a single figure at the wheel, before it rounded the headland toward the harbour and passed out of her sight. And she found, once it had gone, that her hands on the rail had been gripping harder than she realized, and that she let out, in the empty lamp room, a breath that felt like it had been building the whole 20 minutes. She telephoned Margaret that evening to ask, and was told, with evident relief audible even down the line, that the boat had come safely in an hour before dusk. Later than expected, but entirely unharmed, the crew soaked through and glad of a hot meal, but otherwise no worse for the day's misjudged timing. Margaret thanked her for asking, and then, after a small pause, added that it was a good thing, a lighthouse, with someone watching from it again, that a machine could flash a warning well enough. But it took a person standing at the glass to actually worry about who the warning was for, and Iris, setting the telephone down afterward, sat for a while at the kitchen table turning this thought over, understanding that she had, without quite planning to, spent 20 minutes of a stormy afternoon doing precisely the thing every keeper on the workroom shelves had apparently always done, watching the sea, not merely as weather, but as a place other people's lives were, at that very moment, being risked within, and finding that this small act of watching, useless as it was in any practical sense to a boat she could not have helped by any means, beyond a telephone call already available to anyone, had mattered to her more than she would have predicted it could. She thought, sitting there with her tea gone cold beside her, that this was perhaps the truest thing the Ledgers had been trying to tell her all along, that keeping a light was never really about the mechanism, which any competent engineer could design and any automated system could operate untended for years on end, but about precisely this: someone caring enough to stand at the glass and watch, and to feel, in the watching, the full weight of what was actually at stake beyond the rail, by the time true dusk arrived, indistinguishable from the day's grey light except by the clock. The storm showed its first signs of easing, the wind's long, shuddering gusts spacing out with slightly longer gaps between them, the rain thinning from sheets to something closer to ordinary heavy weather. She climbed once more to the lamp room before settling for the evening, and found the sea still working hard against the rocks, but with a fractionally less committed violence than the morning had shown, the light continuing its indifferent sweep, and stood at the glazing for a while, simply watching the day's weather begin its slow retreat, feeling, as she watched, a tiredness that was not unpleasant, the specific fatigue of a day spent properly attending to something that mattered, rather than the flatter exhaustion of a day spent merely getting through. She wrote a full entry that night, longer than any she had yet attempted, setting down the storm's arrival, and its long attritional middle hours, and its first signs of easing, the loose slate and the bucket beneath it, the empty sea she had watched all day, with a vigilance that had asked nothing practical of her, and yet had felt, all the same, entirely necessary. She read the entry back once it was finished, and found she was, for the first time since opening her own ledger, satisfied with what she had managed to set down, that it read now not like the tentative notes of a visitor, but like the record of someone who had properly kept a difficult day, and understood, closing the book, that something in her had shifted during the storm's long hours in a way she had not fully noticed happening until she saw it reflected back at her in her own handwriting. The following morning broke clear and washed, the particular scoured brightness that follows a proper storm. Every color on the headland, somehow more saturated than it had been before, the sea gone back to its ordinary working grey-green, though still carrying, she noticed walking down to look at it, a heavier swell than usual, the aftermath still working its way out of the water even as the sky above had already forgotten it. She walked the coast path that morning further than she had yet gone, past the point where the path she knew gave way to one she did not, finding, around a headland she had not previously rounded, a small cove she had no memory of from any childhood visit, its sand strewn with the storm's leavings, tangles of kelp and a scattering of shells, and, half buried near the tide line, a single weathered plank that might once have been part of something larger, and she stood looking at this small evidence of the previous day's violence with a feeling that was not quite melancholy, closer to a kind of respect, the sea's casual reminder that it gave up, sometimes exactly as much as it took. The days that followed the storm settled into a new rhythm, subtly different from the fortnight that had preceded it, the light itself changing as the season properly turned, the mornings arriving later and the evenings closing in earlier with a speed that felt, after the long light of her arrival, almost startling. She noticed the change first in small ways. The need to light a lamp in the kitchen by late afternoon, the garden's last defiant roses finally giving up their canes to the wind, a morning frost, thin and brief, silvering the headland grass for the first time since she had come. She wrote of these changes as they arrived, her entries growing steadily more assured. The weather notation she had once been too uncertain to attempt now, coming to her with something approaching ease. The vocabulary of wind and sea state settling into her hand the way any new language settles, gradually. And then, past a certain point, without conscious effort, she returned to the small cove several times over the following weeks, drawn back to it in a way she did not entirely examine, finding on each visit some fresh, small thing the tide had turned up, a scrap of net long since parted from whatever boat had lost it, a smooth length of driftwood, pale as bone, and, on one particular morning of hard, bright cold, a small green bottle, sea-worn to a soft, frosted opacity, its cork long gone, that she carried home and set, after some consideration, on the kitchen windowsill among the row of small objects her grandfather had gathered over his own decades of walking this same shore. A stone, a scrap of blue sea glass, a gull's feather standing in its old ink bottle, and now, beside them, her own first edition, small and unremarkable, and entirely hers. She stood looking at the row for a while after setting it down, understanding that this was, in its modest way, the beginning of a collection that would, given enough years, come to hold as many small stories as the ledgers themselves, though none of them would ever be written down, simply gathered and kept and looked at now and then. On an ordinary evening, she began, on these cove walks, to notice the particular geology of the place in a way she had not thought to before. The layered rock exposed at low tide telling, she supposed, a story far longer than even Josiah Rennick's earliest ledger could account for, and found herself, one grey afternoon, sitting on a flat outcrop with her knees drawn up, watching the tide work its slow way back in, thinking not of any particular thing but simply letting her mind rest in the rhythm of the water's advance and retreat, and understood, sitting there, that this too was a kind of keeping, a quiet, unhurried attention that asked nothing of her beyond her presence, and that she had not, in all her years in London, allowed herself an afternoon quite like this one, empty of any purpose beyond the purpose of simply being somewhere, watching something patient do what it had always done. She had, by this point, written twice more to the museum, each letter a little less certain than the last that she would be returning by any particular date, and had received, in reply, a kindness she had not entirely expected. Her supervisor writing that the department could manage without her longer than either of them, had first assumed that there was, if she wanted it, a possibility of arranging some portion of her conservation work remotely, a scanner and a careful courier being, in this modern age, sufficient to bridge a distance that would once have made such an arrangement impossible. She read this letter standing at the kitchen window with the sea visible beyond the glass, and understood, reading it, that a door she had assumed closed was in fact standing open, that the life she had left in London was not asking her to choose it over this one so much as offering generously to accommodate whichever shape her life was in the process of becoming. She was invited, that same week, to the village harvest service, Margaret arriving at the cottage gate on the Sunday morning with the particular brisk insistence of a woman who had decided a thing was going to happen and did not intend to be argued out of it, and Iris found herself walking down into the village in her one good coat, past cottages strung with small handmade decorations of corn and late flowers, to a squat stone church, whose Norman tower she had passed a dozen times without ever going inside. The church smelled of damp stone and beeswax, and, more strongly than either, of the harvest offerings themselves, heaped along the base of the altar rail in a display that struck her as both entirely ordinary, in its way, quietly moving, marrows and apples in jars of blackberry preserve, and loaves shaped into elaborate plaited crowns, the whole village's small surplus gathered together and given over, in the old unfussed way of places like this, to be shared out afterward among those who had less of it. She sat beside Margaret in a pew worn smooth by generations of exactly this Sunday, and found, partway through a hymn she did not know the words to but whose tune felt somehow already familiar, that she was crying quietly, not from any particular grief but from something closer to its opposite, a fullness she had not expected to feel sitting in a cold stone church among people she had known for barely a month, the sense of having been, without any effort of her own beyond simply staying, absorbed into something larger and steadier than her own single life, a community that had been gathering in this same building for this same purpose for longer than any ledger on the workroom shelves could account for. Afterward, in the churchyard, an elderly man she had not met introduced himself as having served alongside her grandfather on the parish council for the better part of 2 decades, and told her, in the unhurried way she had come to recognize as the local manner of delivering the things that mattered most, that Thomas Calder had never missed a harvest service in all the years he had known him, storm or no storm, because, he said, a keeper who watched over other people's safety the whole year round owed it to the village, at the very least, to sit among them once a season and be simply a neighbor rather than a light on a hill. She carried this small story home with her, and wrote it into her ledger that evening, understanding that it belonged there as much as any weather notation, another small thread in the long fabric she had come to be weaving without quite noticing the weaving of it. She telephoned her supervisor the following week to properly discuss the arrangement his letter had proposed, and found the conversation easier than she had expected, the two of them settling quickly into the practical details, which documents could safely travel by courier and which required the museum's own controlled environment, how often she might need to return to London for work the remote arrangement could not accommodate. He asked her, toward the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, how she was finding it up there, and she found herself pausing before answering, aware that the honest answer required more than the brief pleasantry the question probably expected. She told him, in the end, simply that she had not expected to feel so entirely at home, somewhere she had only properly visited a handful of times as a child, and that she thought, increasingly, she was not going to be returning to London in any permanent sense, though she hoped very much to keep doing the work for as long as the department would have her doing it from this distance. He was quiet for a moment on the line, and then said kindly that this did not surprise him in the least, that she had always struck him as someone suited to work that asked for patience and stillness rather than pace, and that a lighthouse seemed, now he thought of it, exactly the kind of place that might finally give her both in the quantities she had always seemed to want without quite knowing how to ask for them. She thanked him, and found, setting the telephone down afterward, that his words had settled something in her she had not fully realized was still unsettled, the last small worry that choosing this place meant abandoning the other one, when in fact, she understood now, it meant nothing of the sort, only that she had found room, at last, for both. She began, in the weeks that followed, to bring a portion of her museum work north with her, a small parcel of documents arriving by careful courier one grey Tuesday, and found, setting up a version of her conservation bench at the kitchen table, the light from the window falling exactly where she needed it, that the two kinds of careful attention she had spent her adult life dividing between two different rooms could, in fact, sit easily together. In this one, the fragile old paper of her museum work and the fragile old paper of the ledgers on the workroom shelves, both asking, in the end, for the same patient, unhurried hands. The first parcel held a small collection of 18th-century shipping correspondence. Water-damaged and brittle, letters between a merchant house and its captains that had nothing whatsoever to do with Fenner's Point, and yet felt, working on them at the kitchen table, with the actual sea visible through the window, not 200 yards from where the letters' long-dead captains had once sailed, less like an abstract academic task and more like a continuation of the same work she was already doing every evening in her own ledger, the careful preservation of a record that someone, someday, might want to read and understand. She worked through the documents over several unhurried afternoons, easing apart pages that had fused together with damp, backing torn corners with the thinnest tissue, and found the work went better here than it ever had at the museum bench. Her hands somehow steadier, her patience somehow deeper, in a kitchen that asked nothing hurried of her. One letter in particular held her attention longer than the rest. A captain writing to his employers from a harbour some 100 miles down this same coast, describing a passage made difficult by exactly the kind of weather she had now begun to recognize from her own reading of the ledgers, wind backing hard from the northeast, and a sea that had cost him 2 days' delay and no little worry. Though he assured his employers, in the careful, formal hand of his century, that the cargo remained entirely sound and the crew in good health, all due, he wrote, to God's providence and the excellent keeping of every light along this stretch of coast, without which no captain in his right mind would attempt these waters after dark at any time of year. She sat with this single sentence for a long while, understanding that she was holding, in her careful conservator's hands, a stranger's 200-year-old gratitude for exactly the kind of watching she herself had begun, however modestly, to practice, the correspondence, and the ledgers turning out, in the end, to be two halves of the very same conversation. One side written by the ships that passed, and the other by the keepers who watched them pass safely. It was during this same stretch of weeks that the loose slate she had first noticed ticking overhead during the storm was finally properly seen to. A roofer from 2 villages along, recommended by Margaret and engaged over the telephone, a broad, quiet man named Elliot, who arrived on a still, bright morning with a van full of ladders and spent the better part of a day on the cottage roof, and who, coming down for a cup of tea at midday, told her, unprompted, that he had done this same job for her grandfather more than once over the years, that Thomas Calder had been particular about the roof in a way he was not particular about much else, on the theory, stated to Elliot more than once, that a keeper who could not keep his own roof watertight had very little business lecturing the sea about anything. She laughed at this, properly laughed, for what she realized afterward was the first time in some weeks, and found, watching Elliot finish the job that afternoon, the new slate sitting clean and pale against the older weathered ones around it, a small satisfaction in having put right, however modestly, one more piece of the place she was gradually making whole again. Margaret's nephew came by the cottage himself, some days after the storm, a broad, sunburnt young man named Robbie, who stood rather awkwardly at the gate for a moment before Iris invited him in, and who told her, turning his cap in his hands at the kitchen table, that his aunt had mentioned she'd been up at the tower watching for his boat that stormy afternoon, and that he'd wanted to come and thank her properly for it, though he supposed there was nothing she'd actually done beyond the watching. She told him, honestly, that this was true, that she had done nothing beyond stand at the glass with her heart somewhere in her throat. And he said, in reply, that this was exactly what a lighthouse had always been for. In the end, someone caring enough to watch, and that his Uncle Thomas had said much the same thing to him once, years before, and that it meant more than she perhaps realized. A boat coming home to find someone had been worried for it. He would not stay for more than a cup of tea, refusing a second with the particular embarrassed haste of a young man unused to being thanked. But she found, after he had gone, that she carried the conversation with her for the rest of the day, and wrote it into her ledger that evening as carefully as she had written the storm itself. Autumn deepened properly through the following weeks. The garden, cut back at last under her own increasingly confident hand, settled into its winter shape, bare canes and turned earth, waiting out the cold months for whatever she chose to plant when spring returned. She learned from Margaret, and from the shopkeeper, and from a handful of others in the village, who had, by degrees, stopped treating her as a visitor, and begun simply including her in the ordinary traffic of local news, the small rhythms of a coastal year she had known only distantly as a child, the fishing boats that went out less often, now the weather had turned, the church's harvest service, the particular quality of a Northumberland November that she found, to her own quiet surprise, she did not dread the way she had always dreaded a London November. The darkness here feeling less like something closing in, and more like something the whole place simply accepted, gathering itself in for a season it had weathered every year for longer than anyone could properly count. The headland itself seemed to change character entirely as the light thinned. The gorse that had stood thick and yellow through her first weeks lost its flowers and settled into a darker winter green, and the grass, which had moved constantly in long silver sweeps through the summer wind, now lay flatter and more subdued, rhymed most mornings with a frost that took until nearly midday to properly lift. She took to walking earlier, wrapped against a cold that had a different quality here than any cold she had known in London. Cleaner somehow, carrying none of the city's damp exhaust weight, simply the sharp, mineral chill of a wind that had crossed a great deal of open water before it reached her. She found she looked forward to these walks in a way she had never looked forward to her old London commute. The same stretch of coast path, offering something slightly different each morning depending on the tide and the light. A seal she glimpsed twice, hauled out on the rocks below the point. A skein of geese passing high overhead. One grey dawn, in a ragged arrow, she stood and watched until it had entirely vanished, their calling drifting back to her long after they themselves had gone. She began, in the evenings now properly dark by mid-afternoon, to spend more time in the workroom than she had in the storm's immediate aftermath, not merely maintaining her own record, but working her way, volume by volume, through the full run of the shelves in proper sequence, reading not for any particular purpose beyond the pleasure of it, the way one might read a long family history, a chapter at a time, coming to know the individual voices of keepers she had previously only sampled. A woman, she discovered with some surprise, reading a run of volumes from between the wars, having kept the light for the better part of a decade after her husband's death at sea, her hand firm and unsentimental, her single evening observations often turning to practical matters of the garden or the weather's effect on her small flock of hens, and once, memorably, to the arrival of her first grandchild, recorded with the same restrained warmth Iris had come to recognize, as a family trait passed down through generations who had perhaps never met one another, and yet wrote, each in turn, in remarkably similar cadences, as though the ledger itself taught its keepers, over time, how a keeper ought to sound. She stood at the tower rail most evenings now, not for any practical necessity, but because it had become, without her quite deciding it should, the closing ritual of her day, watching the light begin its sweep as true dusk fell, watching whatever the sea and sky were doing on that particular evening, and finding, in this small daily observance, the same steadying attention she had first felt, cleaning the lens on her third afternoon at the point, the sense of a mind properly occupied by something worth its full attention. She began, on these evenings, to notice details she would not have thought to look for a season before, the particular way the light caught a returning fishing boat's wake, the first arrival of birds she had not yet learned to name. Passing through on some longer journey the ledgers, she found, looking back through them, had recorded faithfully across 100 autumns before this one, always at roughly the same date, always noted with the same quiet pleasure at their return. She found, standing at the rail one particularly still evening in early December, the light not yet needed against a sky, still holding a last pale band of gold, low over the water, that she had begun to measure her days by this ritual, in a way she had once measured them by the London Underground's timetable. The rail becoming, in its quiet way, as fixed a point in her life as any train platform had ever been, except that where the platform had asked only her punctuality, the rail asked her attention and gave back, in return, something the platform never had, a sense each evening of having properly witnessed the day's ending rather than simply having survived through to its close, she thought, standing there with her breath showing pale in the cold air. of the countless evenings recorded in the ledgers below, each one a keeper doing precisely this, and understood that she was no longer performing an inherited duty so much as discovering, for herself, exactly why the duty had been worth inheriting. The approach of the solstice brought its own small observances to the village, a scattering of lights appearing in cottage windows along the lane, the shop's window dressed with a modest display of holly and ribbon, and Iris found herself invited, this time by the shopkeeper rather than Margaret, to help decorate the church for the coming season, an afternoon spent among a handful of village women weaving greenery along the pew ends and setting candles in the deep stone windowsills, an afternoon that asked nothing more demanding of her than steady hands and easy conversation, and that left her, walking home along the darkening coast path with the first stars appearing over a calm sea, feeling more thoroughly woven into the fabric of this particular corner of the world than she had felt anywhere in a very long time. She thought, walking, that she would write a full page that evening rather than her usual few lines, wanting to set down properly this feeling of belonging that had crept up on her so gradually she could not have named the day it arrived, only that it had undeniably arrived. She spent one particularly still December afternoon at the kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of paper, sketching, as she had begun to do most weeks now, her plans for the garden come spring, working out, with a seriousness that would have amused her old London self, exactly where the roses might be retrained along the front wall, and where she might put in the kitchen herbs, Margaret had suggested, close enough to the door to be cut without a coat on damp mornings, and a small bed for the sweet peas, her grandfather's own garden notes, discovered folded into an old seed catalogue in the sitting-room drawer, described as having done particularly well against the south wall in a good year. She found the sketching itself a pleasure entirely separate from any eventual planting, a way of thinking forward into a season she had not yet seen at the point. Spring being, she realized working over the page, still an entirely unknown quantity to her. A version of this place she had not yet met, and she found herself looking forward to it with an anticipation that surprised her, given how recently she would have described herself as someone who looked forward to very little beyond the ordinary relief of a quiet weekend. She wrote, that same week, a long letter to an old friend from university, a woman named Charlotte, with whom she had shared a flat for several years before Charlotte's own marriage had taken her out to the suburbs, and found, composing it, that she had a great deal more to say than she had expected, the words coming easily in a way her occasional dutiful messages to old London friends had not managed in some time. She described the cottage and the tower and the ledgers, and found herself describing them, articulating for the first time in full sentences rather than private, thought exactly what had changed in her over the autumn, writing that she had not, in coming here, run away from anything in particular, only that she had arrived somewhere and found, to her own surprise, that it fit her more precisely than the life she had been living, the way a coat you did not know was the wrong size only becomes apparent once you have tried on the right one. Charlotte's reply came within the week, warm and unsurprised, in a way that suggested she had perhaps seen this coming before Iris had seen it herself, and included a line Iris found herself returning to more than once over the following days. You always did keep things carefully, Charlotte had written, remembering the meticulous way Iris had once kept even her university notes. It makes sense. You would end up somewhere that finally asked you to keep something that mattered as much as this clearly does. The first proper snow of the winter came in the week before the solstice, arriving overnight without any of the drama the storm had brought. Simply a stillness in the air when she woke, and then drawing back the curtainless window's view, a headland gone entirely white and silent. The sea beyond it, a deep working slate against the pale land. And she stood a long while at the window before dressing, watching a fox make its unhurried way along the base of the garden wall. Its tracks, the only mark on the whole white expanse of the front garden, before it slipped through a gap in the hedge and was gone. She climbed to the tower that morning specifically to see the view from the rail under snow, and found it, when she reached it, quieter than any view she had yet seen from that height, the whole headland muffled and still, the automated light looking somehow smaller against the sudden vast whiteness of everything around it, and stood there a long while simply looking, before climbing back down to write the morning's entry with fingers still cold from the rail, describing the snow and the fox's tracks and the particular hush that had fallen over the whole point. A hush, she suspected. Reading back through the older volumes that evening, every keeper before her had known in some version the same first snow arriving in the same quiet way, across generations of the same headland. It was that same snow-hushed evening, close to the year's shortest days now, the dusk arriving properly by mid-afternoon, and the tower's automated light burning through what felt like the greater part of each day, that she climbed to the workroom not to read but simply to sit for a while among the shelves. Her own 3 ledgers now standing at the end of the long row, still slim compared to the decades-thick run of her grandfather's volumes. But no longer, she thought, looking at them, an obviously new edition, already beginning to take on the particular worn quality of a book that has been opened and closed most days for months rather than weeks. She took down, that evening, the final volume her grandfather had kept, the one she had read most carefully of all in her first days at the Point, and turned to its last completed page, the entry from some weeks before his death, written in a hand grown visibly less steady than the confident, forward-leaning script of his earlier decades, but still, unmistakably, entirely, his own. The weather notation was brief that day, a mild autumn afternoon much like the ones she had since come to know, and beneath it, the final line he had ever written in any of the ledgers, one she had read perhaps a dozen times since her arrival, and that struck her freshly each time. I find I have not the strength for the tower stairs most days now, and must trust the lens to keep itself a little longer than I would like, though I climbed today all the same, slowly, and stood at the rail a good while, and the light was very fine on the water, and I thought, as I have thought most evenings for 40 years, that I would not have chosen any other life than this one, whatever it has cost me, and that I hope, when the time comes for someone else to stand at this rail, they will find in it something of what I have found, which is more than I could ever properly set down, though I have tried, most evenings, to set down what I could. She sat with the ledger open in her lap for a long while after reading this, the workroom quiet around her, the shelves holding their long, unbroken record, Josiah Rennick's looping formal hand at one end of the row and her own still forming one at the other. Everything between them, a single, continuous conversation, she understood now, fully, that she had not simply inherited but joined, in exactly the sense her grandfather's last message to her, relayed through the solicitor, had intended. The light still needs keeping, even if only in the old way. She understood it now. She had learned it, over the slow, accumulating weeks since her arrival, in precisely the way he had predicted she would. She thought, sitting there in the cold workroom, with the snow still faintly visible through the small, deep-set window, of everything the autumn had brought her. The storm and Robbie's boat, laboring home through it, the harvest service and the churchyard's quiet story of her grandfather's unbroken Sunday attendance, the small green bottle now standing on the kitchen windowsill among the row of objects that had once been only his and were now, in some part, also hers. Elliot's new slate sitting clean against the old, Charlotte's letter with its line about keeping things carefully, the fox's tracks unmarked across the morning's first snow. None of it, taken separately, amounted to very much. A season's worth of ordinary small events, the kind that would never trouble the pages of any history beyond these private ledgers. And yet she understood, sitting there, that this was precisely the point the whole long shelf of volumes had been making to her, patiently, one keeper's hand after another, since her first night reading them at the kitchen table, that a life was not made of its large events, which were rare and often outside anyone's control, but of exactly this accumulation of small kept things, watched and recorded, and, in the keeping of them, made to matter simply by virtue of someone having thought them worth the keeping. She wondered, allowing herself the thought fully for the first time, what her own final entry might read like, decades from now, to whichever keeper came after her, whether it was a child of her own she did not yet have, or some more distant relation, or, as had happened once already on these shelves, a stranger to the family entirely, taking up a post that asked, in the end, only for the same patient attention, regardless of whose blood carried it forward. She found she did not need to know the answer to be at peace with the question, that the not knowing was, in fact, rather the point, the ledgers existing precisely to carry forward whatever answer eventually arrived, in whichever hand happened to be holding the pen when it did. She closed his final volume and set it back carefully in its place on the shelf, and took down her own, and turned to a fresh page, and sat for a while, simply looking at the blank white space before beginning to write, feeling, as she often did now beginning an entry, the particular settled pleasure of a task she had come, properly, to know how to do. She wrote the weather first, with the ease of long practice now, the wind backing slightly through the afternoon, the sea moderate, a single fishing boat sighted returning to harbor before the light. And then, beneath it, in the space every keeper before her had reserved for the day's single human observation, she wrote what she had been turning over in her mind since finishing his last entry. I read his final page again tonight. I think I understand now most of what he meant by it, though I suspect understanding a thing like this is never really finished, that it keeps deepening the longer you stay, the way the sea keeps teaching you something new about itself every season you spend beside it. The museum has agreed I can do a good portion of my work from here, and I find I have stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement and started thinking of it simply as where I live. I planted nothing in the garden this autumn, on Margaret's advice, since it is too late in the season for most things. But I have begun sketching, in the evenings, what I mean to put in when spring comes. Roses along the front wall and herbs by the door, and sweet peas against the south wall, where his own notes say they always did well in a good year, and I find I am already thinking in seasons rather than in weeks, which feels, more than anything else that has happened since I arrived, like the true sign that this has stopped being his house that I am looking after, and become simply my house, in the way that a house becomes yours, which is not by ownership, but by the accumulation of exactly this: ordinary evenings, ordinary weather, ordinary small observations, set down one after another, until they add up, given enough time, to a life. There was a boat laboring home through the October storm that I watched from the rail for 20 minutes without being able to do a single practical thing to help it. And it came in safely, and Robbie came by afterward with his cap in his hands to thank me for the watching, though I told him truthfully there had been nothing to thank, and I understood, hearing him say it anyway, exactly why every keeper on these shelves has thought the watching worth recording. There was a harvest service where I cried without quite knowing why, and a green bottle from the cove now sitting on the windowsill beside his stone and his sea glass and his feather. And this morning a fox crossed the front garden in the first snow and left the only mark on the whole white expanse before it slipped through the hedge and was gone. And I stood at the window a long while simply watching the place it had been. None of it, taken alone, is very much. Taken together, I am beginning to understand. It is everything the ledgers have ever tried to hold. The wind moved steadily over the darkened headland as she wrote, carrying salt and the low continuous sound of the sea against the rocks below the point, and the light above her turned in its patient mechanical sweep, on and on, out across water that had carried every keeper's ships and every keeper's storms and every keeper's small, quiet evenings, for longer than any single volume on the workroom shelves could properly hold. She finished the entry, read it back once, and did not change a word of it. She closed the ledger and set it beside the others. The whole row complete for another evening. Another day added to the long conversation that had been running, without real interruption, since a formal looping hand had first taken it up more than a century before. And that would, she understood now, with a settled certainty she had not possessed on her first uncertain night at the point, continue running long after her own hand had finished. Adding to it, some other keeper, some other evening, standing at the same rail, watching the same light on the same water, and finding in it, she hoped, something of what she had found, and setting it down, in their own turn, as she had set hers down tonight. She sat a while longer at the workroom table before climbing back up to the kitchen, letting the cold stone silence settle around her, the small circle of lamplight holding the row of ledgers and her own hands and very little else, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of the curlews her grandfather had recorded on her very first night, reading his hand, calling long after dark, while he stood at the rail too cold to properly justify staying, and stayed anyway. She had learned, over the autumn, to tell a curlew's call from a peewit's at last, the thing he had once despaired of teaching her, and she thought, sitting there, that this small fact would have pleased him more than almost anything else she could tell him now. A granddaughter who had finally learned to listen properly to the birds he had spent 40 years listening to beside this same tower. She banked the range once she reached the kitchen, checked the latch on the front door out of habit rather than any real concern, and climbed the narrow stairs to the room that had been hers as a child and was fully, now, entirely her own, and lay listening to the house settle around her, the wind steady beyond the window, the sea patient and unhurried below the point, doing, as it always had, exactly what it had always done, indifferent to the hour and entirely certain of itself, she thought, drifting now toward sleep, of the row of ledgers waiting below, complete and ongoing, of Margaret's terrier and the shopkeeper's careful kindness, and the small cove around the headland with its scattering of storm-tossed shells, of Elliot's clean new slate, and Robbie's awkward cap-turning gratitude, and Charlotte's letter still propped on the mantel downstairs, of the garden she meant to plant when spring finally came, roses and herbs and sweet peas against the south wall, and of the light turning steadily above her through the whole of the night, needing for its mechanical operation no one at all, and needing, for everything else it had ever properly meant, someone exactly like her, keeping watch, keeping the record, keeping, in the old way her grandfather had asked of her, without quite asking, the quiet, unbroken continuity of a place that had been loved, carefully, and without interruption, for far longer than any one life could account for, and would, she was certain now, go on being loved for a good while yet. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed, but for a single fox's crossing, pale and complete under a clearing winter sky, and the headland slept beneath the turning light. The sea worked on, patient and eternal, at the rocks below the point, exactly as it had worked at them through every keeper's watch recorded on the workroom shelves, and exactly as it would go on working long after this particular winter had given way, as every winter here eventually did, to a spring she had not yet seen and was already, in careful pencil sketches at the kitchen table, beginning to plan for. And in the small, warm room at the top of the narrow stairs, Iris Calder slept deeply and without dreams. At home, at last, in the place that had always, in some quiet way, she had needed the whole autumn to understand, been waiting for her to come back and keep it, sleep well,